Welcome to Transparency with Diana B., a podcast from wealthmanagement.com focused on advisors' personal well-being and healing. In this podcast, we explore some of the deepest struggles and hardships that many advisors face and bring these issues out into the open so that others may find healing. Join us for this journey where we explore ways to overcome the stresses and anxieties as Diana draws from years of expertise and guest experts to manage the personal challenges of advisors.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Transparency with Diana B., a podcast by wealthmanagement.com. My name is Diana Britton, and I'm the managing editor of wealthmanagement.com. For those of you who are new to the podcast, each episode focuses on a personal development issue facing financial advisors and financial services professionals. Guests join me to talk about their journey dealing with the struggle and how they found healing. My guest today is John Hyland, co-founder and executive officer of Private Advisor Group, an RIA and the largest office of supervisory jurisdiction at LPL Financial. He's in Morristown, New Jersey. John, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Diana. It's a pleasure.
So John, he's been in the industry for 31 years. A lot of people know John, but few people know his personal story. So I'm really lucky and really grateful to have him joining to share his journey. When John was younger, he became involved with the New Jersey chapter of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, a cause that was dear to him at the time because a beloved aunt had died from acute myeloid leukemia. Am I saying that right, John?
Yes.
It's a form of blood cancer, but he couldn't know at the time how fateful that choice would be for him. In 2010, John was diagnosed with AML himself, and the disease came back 2 times since then. So you've been through a lot, John. And so, I mean, just for purposes of education for listeners, the AML is a type of cancer in which the bone marrow makes abnormal white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets.
Correct. There's different versions of it. But AML is considered the most dangerous, deadly form of blood cancer.
Yeah. So take us back to 2010 when you knew something was wrong with your body. How did you get you had a bone marrow biopsy. How did you know something was wrong? How did you find out?
Yeah, well, I probably would want to go back a little bit before 2010, just to give a little context.
Sure.
For the decade prior to 2010, I was in the greatest shape of my life. I was training 15, 20 hours a week. I raced the Ironman every year. And
so wait, I want to stop you for a second. Tell us the Ironman triathlon. What does that entail? That is a crazy physical. It's one of the most difficult sporting events in the world, right?
Some would say that, yes. It is a 2.4 mile open water swim, then transition to a 112 mile bike ride, and then finally a 26.2 marathon.
Wow.
And
Crazy.
it may sound difficult, but when you break it down, like most things in life, it's manageable.
Mm. So you were doing a lot of physical training.
I did.
For those.
During that 10 years before 2010, I just knew my body really, really well because of the amount of time I exercised and trained. So anything that was kind of wrong, I could feel it.
Mm.
And again, for that whole 10-year period, I raced the Ironman every year. 2008, I actually ended up in the World Championship Ironman race in Kona, Hawaii.
Wow.
And then in 2009, I said, you know what, I'm going to take a year off to train, not to train and not to race. And now we go back to 2010. So I started to training again in early 2010. And I just didn't have it. I couldn't find second gear. It just wasn't coming naturally to me that it usually did. And maybe I'm saying, yeah, John, you're a year older. Maybe you should have never taken that year off. But I tried to barrel through it, and it just wasn't working. So fortunately, one of my best friends is my doctor, Dr. Tony Ciosi. And I called him and said, "Hey, Tony, something's wrong with me. I just know it." And he's a big athlete himself. And he says, "Well, come on in. If there's something wrong, we're going to find out what it is." And so he did all the normal tests that someone would do or a doctor would do to see if there's anything wrong. And 2 days later, he called me and said, "You're fine. You're crazy. You're just getting old. Work harder."
Yeah.
And I took that advice and I went back to my life and continued to try to train and operate at the office. And that's probably 2 weeks later. I called him again. I said, "Tony, I know something's wrong." So he did more tests, found nothing. He referred me to a number of doctors, a rare disease doctor, and then ultimately a hematologist. And that was kind of my last stop. And this was over a period of 2-3 months, probably at this point. And I met with the hematologist, and he says, "Tell you what, John, I'm going to do all the blood work we can do. And if there's anything wrong, we're going to find out."
Mm.
So he called me 2 weeks later, about 2 weeks later, and said, "I got good news for you and I have bad news for you.
Mm.
The good news is nothing's wrong with you. The bad news, we don't know what's wrong with you."
Okay.
And I just
That's frustrating.
incredibly. And I just kept pushing. That's kind of part of my personality in certain ways. And I said, "Well, what else can I do?" And he says, "The only other test we could do, which would not be prudent, is to do a bone marrow biopsy." He goes, "That's the only other test we can do." And I said, "Let's do it." And I knew a little bit about that. I know they're not fun. And I can confirm to you that they are not fun. But the next day I did a bone marrow biopsy. And 2 days later, I was over in my office. And when my flip phone started to ring, I opened it and there was my hematologist calling me. I was kind of like, that's kind of odd. And he says, "Hey, John, is there any chance that you and your wife can come by to the hospital and meet with me later today?"
Mm.
And that didn't sound well.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, what's up, doc?" And he goes, "No, it's just much better that we do this in person and your wife attending. That would really be really good." And so we kind of went back and forth. And I said, "Listen, I'm a little bit of an Irish guy." I said, "Doc, I'm not coming. I'm busy today. You have to tell me what's wrong."
Yeah.
And after a back and forth a couple times, he said this: "You have AML."
Mm.
And to, I think, a lot of people, they don't necessarily what that means. But as
Right.
what you said earlier, Deanna, I had been involved with Leukemia Society for 10 years prior, and I know exactly what AML is.
Mm.
And I know what the prognostic results will likely be. So we talked for a little bit longer on the phone with the doctor. And of course, I agreed to come over to the hospital with my wife right away.
Mm.
And this may sound unusual, but at the time, it was it was a question that just came to my mind. I said to him, I said, "Doc, am I going to live?"
Mm.
And it was silence. And he finally says, "We have a lot of work to do."
Yeah.
And that day was a tough day for me, obviously, because I was in total shock. I knew something was wrong with me, but I didn't know I had AML, of all things. So they gave me the night to talk to my children, talk to my mother, two of the toughest things I've ever had to do.
Mm.
At the time, my daughter was 12, my son was 10, and my youngest was 6. And I had to sit them down that night.
Mm.
I sat down with my 10-year-old and my 12-year-old, and I kind of gave them the overview, but very soft because I don't want to be too direct,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to totally lie either.
Mm.
And I said that, the medicine I need, you can't have it in the house. They only have it at the hospital. And I'm going to be for the hospital for, maybe a month or two. And they seemed to understand it, I see some fear in their eyes, but I think they accepted it. They were confused.
Mm.
And then I went to my 6-year-old.
Mm.
He was watching TV. I pulled him aside. I gave him a very similar type of speech.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, okay, can I go back to the TV show?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it made my night
Mm.
because at 6 years old, he really didn't understand it at all.
Yeah.
And then I had to go to my mother, and that was very difficult. My mom lost her husband, my father, 2 years ago. Prior to that, and she was still struggling, and so for me to come to her house and tell her, that was a tough one.
I bet.
Yeah, and then the next morning I was admitted to the hospital and started treatment immediately.
So tell us about that next year or so for you. You know, what was the treatment like? I know it was definitely tough. You said that was the worst time.
It was definitely the darkest period of my life, no doubt about it. The treatment is barbaric. It is difficult. It hurts. The thing about AML, especially the form of AML I had, it's like a burning fire. It's not something you can wait on. It has to be addressed very aggressively, or you lose. And so I'd say when I was admitted to the hospital that morning, they would put me on a chemotherapy called cytarabine, and they would put it on for 24 hours for 7 straight days.
Wow.
And it kills everything. Ideally, the cancer as well, but it kills pretty much everything else in you. And you have no immune system at the end of the process. And it was just a dark, dark time. And part of the darkness for me was facing my mortality at 43 years old. But it was how rapid it was happening. I never was angry about, why me. It was more about, why is this going to happen so fast? And I wasn't going to have that opportunity to, I won't use the word say goodbye, but in part, that's what it was. Yes, for those first couple of weeks in the hospital, they were absolutely brutal. I had 4 days of 105 fever. They literally, I'm not embellishing here at all. They would put me in a bed or a pool of ice for the entire day.
Wow.
And then they had to put things in my mouth so my teeth didn't break because I was chattering so much.
Oh my gosh.
And that was the period when they thought they would lose me with those high fevers. And for some reason I came out of them, kind of went in and out of consciousness for a number of days past that. And kind of, I don't want to say I woke up one day, but I did come around and opened my eyes, and there was my wife and my priest. And I looked at them, and I just closed my eyes again. And I probably slept for another 12 hours or another day or so.
When you finally, woke up, what was that conversation like with your wife? And I'm guessing the priest wasn't there anymore, but.
It really wasn't a great conversation because I was so ill. It's not as if that I had my mental capacities in a great place or my spiritual. We talked a little bit. She was the only one that was allowed in my room. I was quarantined to the extreme, and she had the shield on and the gloves on and the gown on and everything. And so I didn't have a lot of interaction with anybody other than doctors and my wife. And I could tell you, my wife is she's a rock, through this whole process.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I know that typically when people get chemotherapy, they go in like once a week, right? And they are there for like a couple hours and then they leave. But you were there, you had chemo 24 hours a day, you said?
24 hours a day for 7 straight days.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it wasn't fun. But the good news is that eventually I was in remission.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the doctor coming in with that great news, and I was definitely feeling better physically. So they tell you that awesome news, you're in remission. And then 10 minutes later, they say, it's going to come back. So now we have to think about part two. And
Okay.
part two for me was either doing a transplant at that point in time, or that I would just do extended chemotherapy for 4 more months.
Mm-hmm.
My sisters weren't perfect matches. So statistically, my oncologist said we should go with the extended chemo. He thought that statistically that would give me my best chance to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 4 more months of hospitalized chemotherapy. It wasn't 24/7, but they would do it for 5 hours a day, give me a day off, but I was still at the hospital.
You were
And then 5 hours, take a day off, 5 hours. And then I was allowed to go home for a week between those. But I couldn't be around anybody. It was just my wife and me. The kids would be in the house periodically, and which was kind of really difficult because, in times like now, you want your family, you want to hug your family and your kids, and you couldn't.
Mm.
I couldn't hug the kids for, I don't know, months and months and months, which made it really weird.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are struggling with that right now with COVID-19, not being able to see their loved ones if they're ill. But so you kind of recovered from that bout of cancer. You gained strength. You went back to work in 2011, but it was still, things were still difficult for you. You were struggling with depression, right? During that
Yes,
time?
I did. Not something I knew
Mm-hmm.
because I was depressed. It was really my wife identifying it and my oncologist. And so I'm Irish Catholic, and typically what we do with emotions is we just jam it down and just hope
Stuff
it
it.
never comes back up.
Yeah.
And that didn't work. And my doctor encouraged me to go see a therapist, and it probably took 2-3 months for me to accept that. And I remember going to my first therapy session, and I was fine. I was feeling strong. I go in the room, I sit down. He asks me one question, and I cried for 45 minutes without stop, with no other questions.
Mm.
And I left there feeling so much better. And I can't explain why. We had some more meetings that were a whole lot more constructive. Where we actually
Sure.
did have conversations.
Sure.
And he's really helped me a whole lot managing a lot of the anxiety and the reality of having a cancer like AML.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but what are some of the things that he has taught you and that you've taken to heart in terms of overcoming the anxiety and the depression?
Yeah, so he's a special doctor. He's an oncologist and a therapist.
Mm.
So that's kind of where I really found the connection, because he understood the disease I have
Yeah.
and the challenges. And we went through a lot of different exercises, but he wasn't the type of doctor that he wanted to talk about, did I wet my bed when I was 8 years old? It wasn't one of those type of approaches. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. He was just very pragmatical, and he was really good for me, and we got along, and we just talked a lot.
Mm.
And some of that I probably don't want to share,
Yeah, sure. Of course.
but I still see him every 90, 180 days. And mental illness is tough, and it's hard to diagnose, and it's hard to see it. And I took medications probably for 6 months, got off of it. I really don't have depression anymore. Periodically, I guess we all get a little depression, but things went really well from there. And that in that period also after 2010, 2011, I was dealing with another disease that I'll talk about. I guess I probably better to talk about it after transplant.
Yeah. So tell us about the second time that the disease came back. How did you find out? It was about 4 years later.
It was about 4.5 years later. I had been with my oncologist probably a month earlier, and he did all his tests, and he says, "John, I don't worry about you anymore."
Mm.
He goes, he's been in this space for 30 years, and he says, I could maybe name 3 or 4 people that relapsed this far in. And sure enough, he shouldn't have said that. It was probably about 2 months later, I relapsed. And I was actually, interestingly, I was going to the Invest in Others gala in New York City, and I had a car service taking me in, and literally a block away from the event, my oncologist called again, and he says, "John, I'm sorry, this is the hardest conversation to make, but it's back, and you need to be back in the hospital tomorrow."
Oh my gosh.
And
Wow.
but I went into the Invest in Others gala. Wasn't necessarily my favorite night, but I felt like I had to, should. And it was a difficult night. Went home and went right back to work, so to speak.
Yeah. So what was the treatment the second time?
Yeah, there was a couple steps we had to focus on. First, we needed to get me in remission, which could or could not happen. Now, fortunately, I did get in remission after 4 months of chemotherapy. During that period, we were trying to identify a donor, the best donor I could get. I did get a great donor. He was a 26-year-old male in Germany. And then they had to prepare you for transplant, which is another ugly chemotherapy regimen. And then they scheduled my bone marrow transplant on Good Friday, 2015. And I thought to myself, really? We're going to do this on Good Friday? That wasn't such a great day for Jesus. But I guess all things considered, it worked out pretty well for him. So I went forward with it. And that was probably, when you do get a transplant like that, they take down your immune system completely. There's nothing. And so then when you get your new marrow or stem cell, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to see it come back up, your immune system. And that's a very anxious time, obviously, because it might not come up at all. And that's not a good thing, obviously. But every day, you look at the numbers and they stay flat. And then eventually, fortunately for me, they did start to pop up around day 22. And I was admitted, I was discharged from the hospital probably a month after transplant. But I would be outpatient pretty much every day for the next 3-4 months with testing on a daily basis. And one of the great challenges for many people with transplant is a disease called GVHD, graft versus host disease. And really what it is, it's your new immune system. So now I have an immune system of a 26-year-old German man. And that immune system is looking at my body as a foreign body. So it attacks all your organs.
Right.
And that's not fun. I had that for a while, for a good year and a half of that. Mostly it was my skin and my GI and my mouth. And it was difficult. It was a hard time. So it was, you had a successful transplant, but you don't feel well at all. And then medications you needed to take to deal with GVHD was not fun either. It changed you. It was a lot of steroids, high level of steroids that make you not yourself. And so that was another big challenge post transplant.
Yeah. And so I know that you had to be quarantined a lot during this whole experience. And, for me, I've never had to experience that, being quarantined, until a few months ago. But this is not new to you, this whole experience. And so I'm just wondering, what was that experience like for you? during having cancer, not seeing your kids, and how did you cope with that? For me, I'm able to see my family, and it's not as hard as it was for you, I guess.
There's different versions of quarantine, right? There's ones where you just can't be around anybody. And with the COVID-19 that we've all been dealing with in the last couple of months and continue to, it was maybe good and bad for me. It did trigger some emotions for me from the past about quarantining and quarantine and but in the flip side of it, it was very natural for me to have a mask and gloves and keep distance. It was really, I found it very easy over the last couple months simply because of my history. I could tell you that over the last 10 years, I probably was quarantined for probably close to a year total over those 10 years.
Wow.
So, it's tough though. And for me in this COVID-19 pandemic, I really felt bad for people that don't have means or loved ones around them. It's hard enough when you have loved ones around and people to help you versus people that don't have anybody. And that was really the hardest thing for me in the last couple months, thinking about those people.
Yeah. And you actually had to move because of your immune system. You've had to deal with COVID a little bit differently from other folks, right? I mean, you had to move your home office out of New Jersey, right? Not out of New Jersey, but to a more secluded part of New Jersey.
Yeah. So my doctors highly encouraged me to kind of relocate to a less dense town. I live in Marshtown, New Jersey, which is an amazing town, awesome town, but there's a fair amount of people. And we're blessed to have a house on the bay down in Long Beach Island. So they encouraged us to relocate, and we moved down here, I think March 16th. And it's been great because there's a lot of fresh air and it's not a lot of people. And I'm blessed to have my 3 kids, which all together with us for the last 3 months and the next 2 months as well. And that's something that's probably never going to happen again since they're in college and doing their thing. And it's been a real silver lining for me in this process.
Yeah, it's such valuable time spent with the kids in the last couple months. So I know, you've had several moments in your life where you thought you were going to die, and mortality is top of mind for a lot of folks right now. Do you still have those thoughts? Do you fear that it's going to come back? And how do you cope with that? And how have you coped with it in the past?
So yes, I've had periods in the past that I thought I was going to die. And I've had periods in the past that I knew that I was going to die, which is a different kind of animal. A couple times in the last, not a couple of years, but back when, I would get abrupt symptoms very similar to the first time in 2010, which would make me think I'm going to die. And my therapist helped me a whole lot about that. But I think that for me, it's evolved. It's not about the fear of dying. It's about, you have a certain amount of time left on this earth, and what are you going to do with it? And because that's what we can control. We can't control when, but we control what we do and how we do it and what are our priorities. And there's a number of silver linings around cancer, for me at least, that it gives you a perspective about what really matters. And what I used to think was a problem, I didn't get upgraded to my on United to first class. I mean, that was a problem back when. And you laugh at those things now, like that is not important at all. So cancer does really do give you a perspective that you can't have unless you've done it. I think there's a lot of things like that in life. So really, I really don't focus on, am I going to die? I mean, we're all gonna die. It's just it's not going to hopefully be soon. And what do I want to do with the time? And that's probably my biggest takeaway from the cancer experience is just, what are you going to do with your time? What are your priorities? And really do what is most important to you.
Yeah. And what are those things for you that are most important?
They evolve. I can tell you that.
Are you still doing Ironman these days?
I wish, but my mind's not ready and my body is not ready now. But I hope somewhere in my mind hopes that I can get one more in, a little bit of a competition between me and cancer. You know, I want to be the winner on the end. So that's my plan.
Yeah. And I mean, John, just hearing your story, it's even harder than I originally thought, just what you went through. How did you manage to run Private Advisor Group, which is a large, significant firm in the industry, through these times? I know you said that you leaned heavily on your coworkers and the folks at PAG, and that they were great, during those times. But how did you manage to run it?
Well, I think earlier in my life, I learned that you need to surround yourself with great people. It makes a huge difference in your life. And I'm blessed to have coworkers and friends, Pat Sullivan, Jim Perhax, and James Sullivan. They picked me up and carried me through many periods of this journey, put it that way. But we as an organization, we're very democratic. We have titles, but we really deal with all of our decisions as a collective group. So it worked just fine for us. But again, I was blessed to be surrounded by great people, and they didn't miss a beat. They supported me every single way in the process, and I think it's unique to see it the way it went. There was never complaints. They worked more hours every day, never complained, and they always said that, hey, we've got the easy part.
Yeah,
you got the hard part, John. Don't worry about it. And so we've learned to adapt, and continue to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I remember thinking when my dad had cancer, and I wanted him to do chemotherapy and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, I'm not the one going through this. He's the one going through this, So they were right to say that, I think. Well, we're just about out of time, John. I mean, I could listen, to this all day. I'd like to thank you for joining me, John. Thank you so much for being on the show, and just especially for being so open and honest about what you went through. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And if in any way it helps anybody else, that's what matters.
Yeah, and that's what this podcast is all about. And if you'd like to reach out to John, if you have any questions about his journey, his disease that he had in the past, or anything about Private Advisor Group, you can email him at john.hyland, HYLAND, at privateadvisorgroup.com. And that will also be in the show notes below. If you yourself have a struggle and you'd wish to share your experiences and help others in similar situations, please feel free to reach out to me at transparencywithdianab@gmail.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to Transparency with Diana B. If you've not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This is Diana Britton reminding you that where there is healing, there is hope. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Transparency with Diana B podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of wealthmanagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice. Always seek the advice of your healthcare provider with any questions you have regarding your particular situation.